I am Matthew Vance, 65 years old, and 4 hours ago, I was being forced out of my own 12 mills and thousand oceanfront estate in Malibu, California. My own daughter, Audrey, had me escorted to the front security gates by two hired security guards, telling me I was a senile, useless old man who belonged in a cheap nursing home, not in a luxury mansion. She threw me out onto the street with nothing but two small travel suitcases, a worn-out Ford pickup truck, and a bottle of unmarked white pills. Now I am standing in the freezing darkness of an abandoned fruit-packing warehouse in the Temecula Valley. The rain is pouring down, cold and relentless, soaking through my jacket as I hold a heavy iron crowbar in my hand. I am staring at a massive reinforced steel bulkhead hidden behind a false rotting wooden wall, the red optical light of a biometric retinal scanner blinking in the shadows. Before I continue this story, please let me know which city or country you are watching from in the comments. It brings warmth to this old man's heart. And please hit the like button and subscribe. If you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who underestimated your worth, what I am about to tell you will change how you look at those closest to you forever. Let me take you back to the exact moment my entire reality shattered. It was a gloomy Tuesday morning, exactly 3 weeks after I buried my beautiful wife, Clara. We had been married for 40 incredible years, 4 decades of shared dreams, building a massive shipping and logistics company from the ground up and creating what I genuinely believed was a rock-solid, loving family. I had stepped down as the chairman of Vance Logistics a few years prior, willingly giving up my hard-earned career just so I could care for Clara during her final grueling battle with illness. I loved her more than life itself, and I would have traded all my wealth and success just to have one more healthy day with her by my side. I was sitting in the freezing glass-walled office of our longtime estate attorney, Philip Ward. Across the heavy mahogany conference table sat my daughter, Audrey, and her husband, Julian Thorne. They were dressed in immaculate, custom-tailored designer clothing, checking their expensive watches, and looking more like they were preparing for an exclusive red carpet event than mourning the recent loss of a mother. I sat there in my simple black suit, feeling the heavy exhaustion of grief weighing down my bones. I expected this reading of the will to be a simple, mundane formality. Clara and I had always discussed our estate planning together over morning coffee. I assumed the core assets would remain in my control to manage until my time eventually came, and then it would seamlessly pass down to Audrey. Philip Ward cleared his throat, adjusting his reading glasses as he looked down at the thick stack of legally binding documents. His voice was completely flat and monotonous, entirely detached from the emotional bomb he was about to detonate in the middle of that room. He started by reading the clause regarding our primary residence, the 12,000 luxury oceanfront estate in Malibu. I knew that property inside and out. I had paid for it in pure cash 10 years ago, designing every single inch of it alongside Clara so it could be our perfect forever home with panoramic views of the Pacific Ocean. Philip stated clearly, reading the precise legal jargon without any hesitation, that full ownership and title of the Malibu estate was to be transferred immediately to Audrey and Julian. I blinked hard, believing my 65-year-old ears were playing a trick on me. I waited for Philip to mention my continued right to reside in the home I bought, but he did not. He kept reading as if my 40 years of marriage meant nothing. According to the document, I was left with nothing but an abandoned, rotting fruit-packing orchard and storage warehouse in Temecula Valley. It was a desolate, overgrown piece of property 2 hours away, a barren plot of dirt we had acquired years ago and forgotten about. I leaned forward, my hands gripping the armrests tightly. I asked Philip if there was some sort of clerical mistake. Before Philip could answer, Julian lunged across the table and snatched the document from his hands. He let out a sharp, arrogant laugh that echoed off the glass walls. In that second, the mask of the supportive son-in-law vanished. He looked at me with pure disdain. I will never forget the absolute coldness in his stare. "You heard the man, Dad," Julian said, his voice dripping with venomous condescension. "The Malibu estate is ours now. There is no mistake. Mom finally saw things clearly before she died. She knew you were losing your edge, losing your mind. And frankly, A useless old man like you has no business living in a $12 million property. The room started spinning. The girl I had taught to ride a bike, the daughter I had proudly put through the finest business schools in America, the child I had sacrificed my own sleep to comfort when she was sick, was sitting right next to Julian, looking at me like I was a piece of garbage taking up space. She did not say a single word in my defense. She just nodded her head in silent agreement with her husband. Julian leaned in closer, aggressively tapping the heavy legal paper against the polished wood table. You need to go home, pack your bags, and be out of my property by 5:00 this evening, he demanded, narrowing his eyes. Audrey and I are hosting a private dinner for some very important international clients tonight. We are closing a massive shipping contract, and we absolutely do not have the time or the patience to deal with a senile old fool wandering around the living room and ruining our image. I was entirely numb. My chest ached with a pain far worse than any physical injury I had ever sustained. I do not even remember the long car ride back to the Malibu estate. I just remember the deeply humiliating blur of throwing 40 years of my beautiful life into 2 small travel suitcases. I was forced to pack my most basic belongings while my daughter's hired private security detail stood by the bedroom door, watching my every move as if I were a common thief stealing from a hotel. By 4:30 in the afternoon, I was standing in the grand entryway, literally being pushed out of the very home I had bought with my own blood, sweat, and tears. The heavy iron gates of the Malibu estate hummed as they slid closed behind me, sealing me out of the life I had built. Just as I tossed my 2 travel suitcases into the passenger seat of my worn-out Ford pickup truck, Audrey stepped out from the shadows of the security booth. She wore a sickening, victorious smirk that made my stomach churn. She reached into the pocket of her expensive designer blazer and shoved a small, unmarked plastic prescription bottle roughly into my palm. "Mom's dying wish," Audrey whispered, leaning uncomfortably close to my ear. "Take 2 a day for your brain, old man. Have a safe drive to Temecula. Don't fall asleep on the winding roads." I climbed behind the steering wheel, the worn leather smelling faintly of old coffee. I stared at the smooth white tablets inside the clear container. There was no label, no dosage instructions, and no pharmacy stamp. Clara was a meticulous forensic auditor who scrutinized every contract we ever signed. Leaving me with a decaying warehouse in Temecula and a bottle of mystery pills was completely contrary to the woman I had loved for 40 years. It did not make sense. I needed answers, so I dialed Julian's number. The phone rang 3 times before clicking open. I expected Julian to bark at me, but instead, I heard the clinking of crystal glasses and the murmur of voices. When Julian spoke, the hostility was gone, replaced by a sickeningly sweet tone. "Dad," Julian said, his voice loud, "I am so glad you called. Audrey and I were just talking about you. Did you make it out of the estate all right, Pop? Do you need us to call a car service?" I gripped the steering wheel, grinding my teeth. He was putting on a show, playing the role of the concerned son-in-law for his wealthy guests. "Julian," I said, "why did Clara leave the Malibu estate to you? And what exactly are these pills Audrey shoved into my hand?" Julian sighed, acting like a concerned son-in-law. "Oh, Dad," he murmured, "we talked about this. Mom did this to protect you. She knew you were struggling to keep up lately." I frowned, thrown off balance. "Protect me by throwing me out? Sending me to a rotting warehouse in Temecula?" "Yes, Dad," Julian replied, his tone remarkably patient. "Think about it logically. The property taxes and fees on that Malibu estate run close to $250,000 a year. You are 65 years old and living on a fixed retirement income. If Mom had left the property in your name, the county and the banks would have drained your savings within a year. You would have gone bankrupt trying to maintain a 12,000 asset all by yourself." I sat silently. His words hit me like a splash of cold water. From a financial perspective, it made a brutal kind of sense. Clara had always been ruthlessly pragmatic about taxes and asset protection. Could she have made a cold, calculated decision to preserve my small savings by offloading the liability of the Malibu estate onto Audrey and Julian? "She wanted you to have peace in Temecula, away from the city noise," Julian continued. "And please don't be stubborn about the pills. Your memory has been slipping lately, and Mom was terrified about your cognitive decline. She ordered these special Swiss supplements before she passed and made Audrey promise you would take them. 2 a day. Please, Dad, do it for Mom. I closed my eyes. Was I really losing my mind? Had grief made me paranoid, turning my daughter into a villain simply because I was hurt? I was too exhausted to fight. I told Julian I would call him when I arrived in Temecula and hung up. I sat in the truck cabin for a long time. The logic of his argument slowly settled into my tired brain. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps I was just a tired old man who needed to accept his reality. I popped the cap off the bottle, tapped a single tablet into my palm, and swallowed it dry with a sip of water. I started the engine, put the truck in gear, and drove out of Malibu, leaving my life behind me. The sun was dipping as I merged onto the highway. 50 minutes into the drive, as I turned inland toward the winding mountain passes, the world began to warp. My vision blurred violently, turning the sunset into a chaotic painting. A cold sweat broke out, and my hands shook so violently that I could barely grip the steering wheel. I gasped, realizing my heart rate was dropping dangerously low, feeling like my chest was filling with heavy cement. I slammed the brake pedal, the tires screaming, and jerked the truck onto the gravel shoulder of the mountain road before the world faded into darkness. I woke up with a sudden, violent gasp, my lungs burning as if I had been submerged underwater for hours. My hands gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles aching. The truck cabin was completely dark, save for the faint dashboard lights. I blinked rapidly, trying to force my eyes to focus through the thick, unnatural fog that had taken over my mind. My heart was pounding against my ribs, an erratic rhythm that felt entirely wrong. I checked the dashboard clock. It was nearly 7:00 in the evening. I had been unconscious on the highway shoulder for over 2 hours. I rolled down the window, letting the cold mountain breeze hit my face. The crisp air acted like a physical slap, slowly pulling my senses back. I am 65 years old, but I spent 35 years as a commercial shipping developer. My career was built on spotting discrepancies, identifying risks, and reading people who were trying to hide the truth. I leaned back against the headrest, closing my eyes as the puzzle pieces violently snapped together. Audrey and Julian did not care about my cognitive health. Those white tablets were not high-end Swiss memory supplements. They were heavy, dangerous sedatives. They had deliberately handed me unmarked narcotics right before I drove onto a treacherous, winding highway. If my reflexes had been even a fraction of a second slower, my truck would have plummeted off the cliffs. It would have looked like a tragic accident. A grieving, senile old man who lost control of his vehicle. I reached into the passenger seat, my trembling fingers finding the plastic bottle. A surge of pure anger washed over me, burning away the remaining fog in my mind. I hurled the bottle out the window, listening to it clatter against the rocks and disappear into the dark canyon. I took a deep breath, gripped the gear shift, and pulled my truck back onto the highway. I was no longer a confused, grieving widower. I was a man who had just survived an attempted execution by his own flesh and blood. The rest of the drive inland was a blur of dark, winding roads and pounding rain. I left the coast behind, navigating the steep, slick mountain passes that led deep into the Temecula Valley. By the time my Ford pickup truck crossed the valley threshold, the sun had completely set, casting a cold, pitch-black darkness over the endless rows of vineyards and citrus orchards. The rain hit the windshield with a steady, deafening roar, matching the frantic rhythm of my own thoughts. I turned off the paved state highway and onto a rugged, unpaved dirt driveway choked with overgrown brush and wild weeds. The branches of dying oak trees scraped aggressively against the metal cab of my truck as I crawled forward at a snail's pace, my headlights cutting only a few yards into the thick, dark fog. After a mile of navigating the muddy, rutted path, the dense tree line finally broke, revealing the property Clara had left me. I shifted into park, cut the engine, and stared through the rain-streaked glass. The property was a desolate, abandoned fruit-packing depot and citrus orchard, shut down nearly 15 years ago when local water regulations tightened. The main residential farmhouse and office was a rotting wooden ruin, its porch roof partially collapsed under the weight of wet leaves and neglect. A rusted fruit sorter and a decaying tractor stood like skeleton relics in the center of the muddy yard, swallowed by tall weeds. It looked like a worthless dump, a dead asset that brought in zero revenue and only cost money in annual property taxes. I remembered when Clara and I had first acquired this land. We had planned to expand our logistics operations into agricultural transport, but when the zoning laws shifted, we halted the project. Over the years, the desert brush and wild grass had reclaimed the depot, and I had dismissed it as a failed investment. I assumed Clara had forgotten about it too. But standing here now in the freezing silence of the valley, the absolute neglect felt deliberate, like a carefully maintained mask designed to keep people away. I stepped out of the truck, the cold, damp air hitting my chest and making me shiver. The ground was slick with mud and rotting fruit. I walked toward the caved-in farmhouse, but as I reached the edge of the clearing, my shipping developer instincts flared. I had spent 35 years evaluating logistics hubs, commercial sites, and shipping corridors. My eyes automatically cataloged the layout. The main driveway leading up to the farmhouse was choked with decade-old saplings, proving no residential vehicles had driven that way in years. But as I looked toward the eastern edge of the property, curving around a cluster of towering eucalyptus trees, I noticed a second road. This road was entirely different. The brush along the edges had been recently cleared, and the ground was deeply rutted and heavily compacted. I walked over, crouching down in the rain to shine my heavy metal flashlight directly onto the gravel. The earth was pressed flat, showing fresh, heavy tread marks. These were not the tracks of a stray hunter's pickup truck or a wandering local. These were the deep, distinct impressions left by commercial utility trucks carrying massive payloads. And there were dozens of them, overlapping each other, forming a clear, recently used road that vanished behind a thick grove of trees at the back of the property. I stood up, my heart beginning to race. Why would heavy commercial vehicles be driving through a supposedly abandoned fruit orchard? I followed the compacted tracks on foot, letting them guide me deeper into the dark property. The dense trees parted, revealing a massive corrugated metal barn situated in a natural depression at the very back of the lot. The building's exterior was covered in weathered wood, paneling, and rusted metal sheeting, intentionally designed to blend in with the surrounding forest and look just as abandoned as the main farmhouse. It was a masterpiece of camouflage. But as I stepped closer, my flashlight beam caught a detail that shattered the illusion of neglect. Running down the side of an old wooden utility pole hidden in the trees was a thick, black electrical conduit. I followed the conduit as it ran down from a main transmission line in the valley and connected directly into the side of the weathered barn. It was a brand new, industrial-grade, three-phase power line. In my decades in shipping and commercial logistics, I had only installed three-phase power lines for specific purposes. You run them when you need to support heavy manufacturing equipment, massive industrial refrigeration units, or high-density server farms. You do not run industrial-grade power feeds to an abandoned, rotting barn in a closed valley depot unless you are hiding something that draws a massive amount of electricity. A standard residential hookup only runs single-phase power, enough for lights and basic appliances. But this was a heavy-duty industrial drop, the kind that requires special county permits and a dedicated transformer. I looked up at the nearby utility pole. The transformer was brand new, its gray casing clean and free of the dirt that covered every other surface in these woods. I slowly lowered my flashlight, stepping closer to the massive metal doors of the barn. The air around the structure felt different. There was a faint, almost imperceptible, low-frequency hum vibrating through the wet ground beneath my boots. Someone was drawing a massive amount of electricity into this supposed ruin. Why was there a brand-new industrial-grade three-phase power line running into an abandoned barn? And why were there fresh, heavy-duty truck tire tracks heading straight for the back of the property? I had to find out what was inside. But before I could attempt to breach the barn doors, the freezing rain began to fall even harder, and I knew I needed to secure a base of operations first. I turned away from the humming barn and slowly made my way back toward the decaying farmhouse, my mind racing with 100 different theories. The wind howled through the skeletal branches of the surrounding orchards, carrying the freezing rain in sheets. I pulled my jacket tighter, but instead of walking back to the truck, I was drawn toward the massive metal barn by a force I couldn't resist. Every developer and shipping project manager instinct told me that this structure was the focal point of whatever secret Clara had taken to her grave. I walked up to the towering metal doors, the cold air humming with a low-frequency vibration that seemed to match the nervous pounding of my heart. The exterior paint was peeling in long, rusted curls, and thick cobwebs hung from the gutters. It was a perfect mask of decay. I reached out and ran my hand along the heavy steel latch. There was no standard padlock, no chain, and no keyhole. Instead, the handle was locked tight into a solid, reinforced frame that showed no visible seams. I shined my flashlight around the doorframe. Hidden behind a rusted fake metal utility box mounted on the wooden siding, I found the true locking mechanism. I pried the cover of the box open, expecting to find old fuses or electrical switches. Instead, my flashlight illuminated a sleek, modern security console. The console featured a digital keypad and a matte black proximity card reader, its tiny red indicator light pulsing slowly in the dark. It was a commercial-grade keyless entry system. I recognized the brand immediately. It was the exact same model we had installed in our high-security bonded warehouses at the port of Long Beach to secure international cargo containers. Seeing this advanced, industrial-grade technology mounted on a rotting barn in the middle of a defunct valley orchard was jarring. It confirmed my suspicions. This property was not a worthless liability. It was a highly fortified facility disguised as a ruin. I pressed my fingers against the keypad, but the console remained dark, showing only the pulsing red card reader light. I didn't have the necessary access card or the code. I stood in the rain, my mind racing. Who had installed this system? Had Clara built it, or had someone else taken over our land without our knowledge? My logistics company handled high-value cargo, and I knew that setting up an industrial power hookup and a commercial security system in a remote area required county permits, specialized contractors, and a massive amount of cash. It wasn't something that could be done overnight, and it certainly wasn't cheap. It was a multi-million-dollar engineering project hidden in plain sight. Realizing I couldn't breach the lock without tools or a key, I decided to return to the farmhouse. The rain was getting heavier, and the cold was beginning to seep into my bones. I walked back through the muddy clearing, my boots sinking into the wet clay. I climbed onto the sagging wooden porch of the main house. The front door was slightly ajar, hanging off one rusted hinge. I pushed it open, and the shriek of the metal hinges cut through the silence of the night like a physical blow. I stepped inside and swept the bright beam of my flashlight across the living room. The air was thick with the smell of dry rot, stale dust, and long-abandoned memories. The floral wallpaper was peeling off the walls in long yellowed strips, and the floorboards groaned loudly under my weight. I remembered purchasing this property with Clara 15 years ago. She had stood in this very living room, laughing as she planned to remodel the space for our weekend escapes. The contrast between her warm laughter and the current freezing decay made my throat tighten with grief. In the center of the room sat a single, tattered armchair covered in a dusty gray sheet. I pulled the sheet away, sending a cloud of dust into the air, and sank into the worn cushions. I sat in the dark, the flashlight beam resting on the floorboards, trying to make sense of the pieces. A $12,000 Zhaozen Malibu estate willed to a daughter who treated me like garbage, a mystery bottle of pills that nearly killed me on the highway, and a high-security barn drawing industrial power in a remote Temecula valley. Nothing aligned with the Clara I knew. Clara was a forensic auditor. She was a woman who lived by facts, numbers, and ledger entries. If she had left me this property, she did it for a reason. She was leaving me a message, a path to the truth, and the Temecula warehouse was the key. But as I sat there, the absolute isolation of the property began to weigh on me. The farmhouse was miles away from the nearest town, hidden behind a dense forest and a locked gate. If Audrey and Julian realized their plan had failed, if they discovered I had survived the drive, I would be completely vulnerable out here. The unmarked pills were an assassination attempt, which meant they were desperate enough to use violence. I was 65 years old, and while I was in decent physical shape, I was no match for hired thugs or desperate criminals. Before I could formulate a plan, the sudden, shrill ringing of my cell phone shattered the silence of the room. I flinched, my heart jumping into my throat. The digital ringtone felt incredibly loud and intrusive in the empty house. I pulled the phone from my pocket and stared at the glowing screen. The caller ID showed a name that made my blood run cold. It was Audrey. I stared at the screen as the phone vibrated against my palm. Every instinct screamed at me to let it ring, to keep my presence a secret, but a deeper, more strategic voice told me to answer. I needed to know what they were planning. I needed to know if they thought their plan had succeeded. I cleared my throat, forcing my voice to sound weak and confused, and swiped the screen to accept the call. I brought the phone to my ear, taking a slow, deep breath to steady my shaking nerves. I forced my voice to sound slow, heavy, and extremely tired, playing the part of the defeated old man they believed I was. "Audrey?" I murmured, drawing out the syllables. "Yes, I'm here." "Oh, thank goodness you finally answered." Audrey's voice was pitched artificially high, fluttering with a frantic, desperate level of concern that instantly made my skin crawl. The venomous, icy condescension from the Malibu estate was entirely gone, replaced by a calculated performance of daughterly anxiety. "We've been calling you for hours, Dad. Did you make it there safely? How was the drive?" "I made it," I said, leaning back into the dusty armchair, keeping my tone flat and listless. "I'm currently inside the farmhouse. It's very dark, Audrey, and cold." "I know, Dad, I know, but it's temporary," she said quickly, speaking entirely too fast for a normal conversation. In the background, I could hear the distinct sound of laughter, a toast being made, and a wine cork popping. They were celebrating their victory while I was supposedly freezing in a ruin. "Listen, I was just wondering, have you walked around the outer property yet? Did you happen to look around the yard or go into the old barn out back?" Mom always talked fondly about that specific barn. "Did she perhaps leave anything interesting in there for you? Did you open the big metal doors?" The aggressive specificity of her rapid-fire questions hit me like a physical blow. She didn't actually care if I had survived the treacherous drive through the mountain pass. She didn't care about my grief, my physical exhaustion, or the fact that I was sitting in a freezing, caved-in ruin. She only cared about the barn, the very same barn that was secretly connected to an industrial power grid. It was a transparent, desperate probe. I knew instantly that this phone call was a carefully constructed trap. If I told her the truth, if I told her I had seen the compacted tire tracks, the three-phase electrical conduit, and the biometric card reader, I would be signing my own death warrant. They would know I was onto them, and they would act immediately. I needed to make her believe that her cruel pharmacological plan had worked flawlessly. I needed her to think I was exactly what Julian had called me, a senile, useless old man who posed zero threat. I let out a long, pathetic groan, rubbing my forehead to simulate the physical strain of speaking. "No, Audrey," I slurred, deliberately dragging my words. "I didn't go outside at all. It's pitch black out there, and the rain is pouring down. To be honest, those special pills you gave me, the Swiss supplements, they made me incredibly dizzy on the road. My vision was so blurred I could barely see the highway lines. I had to pull over for a long time just to stop shaking. I barely managed to crawl inside this house." There was a sharp, sudden silence on the other end of the line. I held my breath, listening to the faint clink of crystal glasses fading in the background. I knew Julian was hovering near her, listening to every word, calculating their next move. "You took them?" Audrey asked, her voice dropping into a tight, focused whisper. "You took the pills?" "Yes," I mumbled, making my voice sound weaker, dragging it down into a raspy whisper. "I took one with some water. It knocked me out. My chest felt so heavy. I just dragged myself into the living room and collapsed into this old chair. My head is spinning, Audrey. I can't even stand up straight. I think I'm just going to sleep for a solid week. I can't think about exploring any barns right now. I just need to close my eyes." Another long pause stretched across the digital connection. I could hear her breathing rapidly, processing the information. When she finally spoke again, the frantic, anxious edge in her voice had completely vanished. It was replaced by a smooth, chillingly cold satisfaction that sent a shiver straight to my bones. "Oh, Dad, I am so sorry," she cooed softly, sounding deeply and genuinely relieved. "The long drive must have taken so much out of your system. You just rest now. Don't worry about exploring the property tonight. Just stay securely inside the house, keep the doors locked, and sleep deeply. We will talk again in a few days. Goodbye." The line went dead with a sharp click. She didn't say she loved me. She didn't offer to check on me, and she didn't ask if I had food or heat in the freezing farmhouse. She just hung up, entirely satisfied that the heavy sedatives had done their sinister job and left me completely incapacitated in the middle of nowhere. I lowered the silent phone slowly, staring blankly into the dark, dusty living room. The puzzle was finally locking into place. The unmarked pills were meant to drug me, to keep me physically helpless, or perhaps to make sure I never woke up from my sleep at all. If my reflexes hadn't pulled my truck onto the gravel shoulder, I would be dead at the bottom of a canyon right now. And even now, they wanted me asleep and helpless. I stood up slowly from the armchair, the dust rising around my boots as my mind raced with dangerous possibilities. If Audrey and Julian were so desperately concerned about whether I had entered that barn, it meant there was something incredibly valuable hidden inside it. Something they desperately needed tonight. And they were more than willing to murder their own father to get it. The realization did not break me. Instead, the final remnants of my grief hardened, turning into a cold, unbreakable resolve. They wanted a helpless old man, but they were about to face the shipping magnate who had built an empire from nothing. I walked slowly across the creaking floorboards of the empty living room, moving quietly toward the front of the isolated farmhouse. The large bay window in the front room was heavily covered in decades of thick grime, with several dangerous cracks running diagonally through the glass. I carefully peeked through a relatively clean section of the broken pane, looking out into the expansive, totally overgrown front yard and the long, winding dirt road leading all the way back to the main highway. The bright moon had finally broken through the heavy storm clouds, casting a pale, silver glow over the silent valley. The rain had subsided into a light drizzle, leaving the dark night incredibly still and peaceful. I scanned the distant horizon, my eyes actively searching for any sign of movement. At first, there was nothing out there but the gentle swaying of the wet eucalyptus trees moving in the cold wind. But then, my developer instincts, sharpened by decades of inspecting construction sites in high-crime areas, caught something moving ominously in the far distance. About a mile down the rugged, uneven dirt road, two bright, glaring headlights forcefully pierced through the thick darkness. A large vehicle was steadily, deliberately approaching the isolated property. I held my breath, watching the lights intently. Suddenly, the bright headlights snapped off entirely, plunging the approaching vehicle into total darkness. But the faint, highly rhythmic crunch of heavy tires rolling aggressively over loose gravel continued echoing in the silent night. I squinted hard through the cracked, dirty glass, my heart hammered furiously against my ribs. A large, menacing matte black SUV slowly emerged from the deep shadows of the tree line. It was creeping toward the farmhouse at a predatory, agonizingly slow pace, operating entirely in stealth mode without any lights. It was a customized, high-powered security vehicle with no license plates and heavily tinted windows. They hadn't come all this way just to check on my physical well-being. They had come to violently finish the job. If they found me alive, they would correct their mistake on the spot. My immediate urge was to dial 911 and beg the local sheriff's department to send a patrol car. But I stopped my thumb. Audrey and Julian were not just greedy children anymore. Julian Thorne was a highly connected logistics executive who routinely rubbed elbows with local politicians, customs commissioners, and port authorities. He funded election campaigns across Southern California. If I called the local police in a panic, claiming my daughter sent assassins to a remote farm, it was entirely possible the responding officers were already on his payroll. Or they would simply write me off as a delusional old man suffering from a severe cognitive breakdown. Exactly the narrative Audrey had been carefully planting. I could not risk placing my life in the hands of strangers who might be bought and paid for. I needed someone I could trust implicitly. I needed someone who knew how to handle a violent, life-threatening situation in the dead of night. I scrolled quickly past the emergency numbers on my contact list and found the name I was looking for, Nate Briggs. Nate and I had been best friends for over 40 years. Before entering the private maritime security sector, he had spent 2 decades as a highly decorated reconnaissance marine, serving in the most hostile environments on the planet. He was a veteran of tactical operations and a man who didn't flinch in the face of danger. If anyone knew how to handle a tactical ambush, it was him. I pressed the call button and lifted the phone to my ear, keeping my breathing shallow. The line rang only twice before his deep, gravelly voice answered. I did not waste a single second on pleasantries. "Nate," I whispered, my voice trembling slightly, despite my best efforts to remain calm. "I am in serious trouble. I am out at the old Temecula property, the one Clara bought years ago. There is a black SUV parked right outside the tree line, operating in stealth mode. They killed their headlights before pulling up, and they are just sitting there in the dark. I think Julian and Audrey sent them to kill me." There was absolute silence on the other end of the line. Nate didn't ask if I was joking. He didn't ask if I was overreacting to the shadows or the rain. He simply processed the tactical information with the cold efficiency of a soldier. "Give me your exact coordinates, Matthew," he said, his tone shifting into a sharp military focus. I recited the address from memory, my eyes never leaving the dark silhouette of the vehicle parked near the edge of the driveway. "I am about 20 minutes away if I push my engine," Nate replied, his voice calm but intense. "Listen to me carefully, Matthew. Do not engage them under any circumstances. Keep your phone on silent. Stay out of sight. Keep away from the windows and find a heavy weapon just in case they breach the perimeter before I arrive. Do not let them know you are there." "I am on my way." The line went dead. I slipped the phone into my jacket pocket and slowly backed away from the front window, placing each footstep with agonizing care to avoid the creaking floorboards. The darkness of the house was now my only shield. I needed a weapon, something solid and heavy that could do actual damage if I was forced into a physical confrontation. I moved silently through the dark hallway toward the rear of the house, letting my memory of the floor plan guide my movements into the kitchen. The kitchen was a desolate, empty space, smelling of mildew and old wood. As I ran my hands along the decaying countertops, my fingers brushed against something cold, long and metallic resting on the floor. I crouched down and swept my hand over the linoleum, my fingers wrapping around a heavy, rusted iron crowbar. I gripped the cold steel tightly, feeling a sudden surge of adrenaline. I pressed my back against the damp kitchen wall, my chest heaving with shallow, controlled breaths. The cold iron of the crowbar dug into my palm, a solid and comforting weight. The silence inside the rotting farmhouse was absolute, save for the rhythmic patter of the fading rain on the tin roof. The kitchen was a desolate, empty space, smelling of mildew, old wood, and decay. I had to navigate it with extreme care in the dark, dodging a pile of shattered window glass on the floor and a rusting iron stove. Every second felt like a grueling hour. I knew that staying inside this decaying house was a tactical trap. It had only 2 doors and several broken windows, making it a death trap if the armed men outside decided to breach the perimeter. My shipping logistics career had taught me that in any crisis, mobility was key. I couldn't afford to be cornered like an animal. I carefully reached for the brass handle of the rear kitchen door. It was stiff, fighting against my grip with a slow metallic resistance. I applied steady pressure, my knuckles white, until the latch finally clicked open with a barely audible pop. I eased the door open just wide enough to slip my body through the narrow gap, stepping quietly out into the freezing night air. The backyard was heavily overgrown with thick brush, wild vines, and tall dead grass, providing me with excellent natural cover. I crouched down low, letting the dense vegetation conceal my silhouette, and began to slowly maneuver my way around the side of the house toward the front driveway. I moved with agonizing caution, ensuring that my heavy work boots did not snap any dry twigs or rustle the wet leaves. Every step was a calculated risk. When I finally reached the corner of the rotting porch, I peered carefully through the thick branches of a juniper bush. The doors of the matte black SUV quietly swung open. Two men stepped out onto the gravel driveway. They were not common street thugs or cheap local criminals. They were dressed in high-end black tactical gear from head to toe. They wore heavy Kevlar vests, dark combat boots, and black fabric masks that completely covered their faces, leaving only their cold, calculating eyes visible. In their hands, they carried sleek firearms equipped with long, cylindrical sound suppressors. Based on my experience with port security protocols, I recognized the weapons immediately. They were Heckler and Koch MP5 submachine guns, a favorite of tactical teams. These men were highly trained, heavily armed professionals, moving with terrifying synchronized precision. They communicated entirely through subtle hand signals, their movements devoid of any hesitation. Julian Thorne, with his shipping connections, routinely worked with corrupt private maritime security firms, and it was clear he had tapped into those dark networks to hire these mercenaries. One of the men reached into a tactical pouch on his chest and pulled out a complex electronic device. Even from my hidden vantage point, I recognized the distinct glowing interface of a biometric bypass scanner. It was a highly specialized piece of equipment used by security firms and industrial espionage teams to hack into advanced digital locking mechanisms. My heart hammered furiously against my ribs. Why would a hit squad need a biometric scanner to break into a decaying, rotting farmhouse? The terrifying answer presented itself almost immediately. The two armed men did not turn toward the front porch. They did not even glance at the broken windows of the main house where they supposedly believed I was sleeping off a heavy dose of narcotics. Instead, they completely bypassed the residential structure, turning their backs to the farmhouse entirely. They raised their suppressed weapons to a ready position and began marching silently through the muddy grass. Heading directly toward the massive corrugated metal barn at the far edge of the property, they were completely ignoring me. They were going straight for the barn. I tightened my grip on the rusted iron crowbar, my breathing shallow. I was about to step out from behind the porch corner, foolishly preparing to follow them, when a sudden, silent shadow detached itself from the dense tree line to my right. Before I could even register the movement, a large, calloused hand clamped down firmly over my mouth, and an incredibly strong arm pinned my chest against the cold wooden siding of the house. I thrashed wildly for a split second, my survival instinct screaming, before a familiar, gravelly voice whispered directly into my ear. "It's just me, Matthew. Stay perfectly still." It was Nate. He slowly let go of my mouth, and I turned my head to look at him. He was dressed in dark clothing, his face smudged with soot to blend into the shadows. He carried a heavy tactical knife strapped to his thigh and a suppressed handgun in his holster. He moved with a ghostly, athletic fluidity that defied his age. "Nate," I breathed, the relief washing over me so fast I felt dizzy. "How did you get in here?" I parked my truck a mile back on the fire trail and walked in through the dense forest. Nate whispered, his eyes never leaving the two armed men marching toward the barn. "I saw the black SUV, no plates, the customized exhausts. This isn't a local crew, they are professional contractors. I scouted the perimeter before moving in, and there are no other lookouts. It's just these two scouts. They were sent to verify the barn's status." "They're going for the barn," I whispered back, pointing toward the dark shapes in the distance. "Julian and Audrey must have sent them. They have a biometric scanner." Nate analyzed the tactical layout in front of us, his face a mask of stone in the pale moonlight. "They don't care about you, Matthew. They care about whatever is locked inside that barn. We need to move. We're going to follow them, but we do it on my terms. Keep low, keep silent, and do exactly what I do." I nodded slowly, letting the cold air clear the remaining tension from my body. I lowered my center of gravity, crouching low as Nate began to glide forward like a shadow through the overgrown brush. We began to follow the two armed scouts, keeping a steady distance of about 50 yards behind them. I was careful to step precisely in the deep, muddy footprints they left in the wet earth. In shipping construction, you learn that loose gravel and dry twigs are the loudest alarms. By stepping in their compacted mud tracks, I was able to move in near total silence, the soft, squelching earth absorbing the sound of my heavy work boots. We wove through the dark rows of the decaying citrus orchard, The overgrown lemon and orange trees, dead for years, cast long, distorted shadows in the pale moonlight. The rotting fruit on the ground filled the air with a sweet, nauseating smell that mixed with the scent of wet pine. My mind drifted briefly to Vance Logistics. I had spent decades checking shipping containers, auditing security protocols, and verifying manifests at the ports. I had always insisted on the highest security to prevent smuggling and theft. I never, in my wildest dreams, expected that those same security models and tactical protocols would one day be turned against me by my own daughter and her husband. The cold night air bit into my lungs, carrying the sharp scent of damp soil. The rain had completely stopped now, but the wind continued to howl through the eucalyptus trees, its rushing sound providing us with a natural audio cover that masked our footsteps. Up ahead, the two guards moved with a steady military pace, their weapons raised to their chests. They were completely focused on the massive corrugated metal barn, looming in the natural depression of the lot. The wind rattled the loose metal sheets of the barn's roof, creating a steady rhythmic clatter that helped cover our movements. We closed the gap slowly, narrowing the distance to 30 yards, then 20. The trees began to thin out, forcing us to move through the tall, wild grass. I kept my eyes locked on the faint green glowing lights on their tactical vests. They had reached the front of the barn and were standing right before the weathered wooden panels that concealed the reinforced steel bulkheads. They spoke to each other in clipped, whispered tones, their voices muffled by their fabric masks. One of the guards stepped up to the fake utility box, pulling out the biometric override device we had seen earlier. He began connecting thin, copper-tipped wire leads from his scanner directly to the exposed wiring of the proximity card reader. The device emitted a faint, high-pitched digital hum as it began hacking the encryption. The other guard stood back, pivoting slowly as he scanned the surrounding tree line. His suppressed submachine gun swept in a wide professional arc. He shifted his weight, his eyes scanning the dark woods with a cold, detached efficiency. My heart hammered a furious, painful rhythm against my ribs, but my mind remained cold and focused. I held the rusted iron crowbar in my hands, my palms sweaty despite the freezing cold. I knew the stakes. I was a 65-year-old retired corporate executive, and these were professional killers in their physical prime. Pitting myself against them in a direct, head-on fight was suicide. But the thought of my own daughter, Audrey, standing in my Malibu home, celebrating my supposed death with a champagne toast, completely erased my fear. It was replaced by a sharp, righteous fury. I was ready to tear their lives apart. I crept closer, slipping behind a rusted, abandoned tractor tire that sat near the edge of the clearing. I was barely 10 yards away from the guard on the right. I braced my boots against the mud, preparing to launch myself forward and swing the heavy iron bar at his head. When Nate's hand gently pressed down on my shoulder, I looked at him. Even in the dim silver light, I could see the absolute calm in his dark eyes. He held up a single finger, signaling me to wait, and then leaned in close, his breath warm against my freezing ear. "We take them simultaneously on my mark," Nate whispered, his voice a low, lethal hum. "I will take the guard on the left, the one holding the scanner. You take the one on the right, the lookout. Listen to me carefully, Matthew. Do not aim for the head or the chest. They are wearing military-grade Kevlar plate carriers that will easily absorb the impact. Aim for the back of the knees." He paused, ensuring I was locked onto his words. "A strike to the back of the knee will collapse their leg and drop them to the dirt instantly. Once he is down, I will transition and neutralize him. Do not hesitate. Do you understand?" I nodded, my knuckles turning white as I tightened my grip on the rusted crowbar. The cold steel felt like a natural extension of my arm. I focused my eyes entirely on the target, the back of the right guard's knee, exposed just above his combat boot. Nate held up 3 fingers in the pale silver light. I took a deep, silent breath, bracing my muscles. My lungs burned, and the adrenaline coursed through my veins, making my senses incredibly sharp. He lowered 1 finger. 2. He lowered the second. 1. The shadow that was Nate Briggs suddenly exploded forward, moving with a terrifying, silent speed. I followed him, launching myself out from behind the tractor tire, my boots digging into the wet clay as I closed the final yards in a desperate, adrenaline-fueled sprint. The mud splattered against my jeans, and the wind whipped past my face as I focused entirely on the guard's knee, my vision narrowing to that single crucial target. I raised the heavy iron crowbar high, ready to strike with every ounce of physical strength I had left. The distance closed in a blur of heartbeat-pounding motion. The guard on the right must have caught the sound of my boots tearing through the wet grass, because he began to pivot, his eyes wide behind his black fabric mask. He started to swing his suppressed submachine gun toward my chest, but he was just a fraction of a second too late. I swung the rusted iron crowbar with every ounce of desperate strength I had left, aiming low, exactly as Nate had instructed. The heavy iron bar collided with the back of the man's right knee with a sickening wet crunch. The guard let out a muffled, agonizing grunt as his leg completely buckled beneath him, dropping him instantly to the muddy ground. His submachine gun slipped from his grip, clattering loudly against the concrete slab at the entrance of the barn, the suppressed barrel scraping against the stone. Before he could recover or reach for his dropped weapon, he frantically reached for a heavy tactical combat knife strapped to his thigh. I stepped forward heavily, slamming the heel of my thick work boot down onto his wrist, pinning his hand and the blade to the muddy earth. Meanwhile, Nate was executing his strike with the terrifying, silent efficiency of a recon Marine. He had closed the distance on the left guard in absolute silence, wrapping his massive forearm around the man's neck in an inescapable chokehold. Before the scout could even register his partner had been hit. Simultaneously, Nate swept the man's legs out from under him, bringing both of them down into the mud. The guard thrashed violently, trying to break the grip, but Nate held him in a vice, cutting off the blood flow to his brain. Within 10 seconds, the scout's eyes rolled back, and his body went completely limp. Nate did not waste a single heartbeat. He released the unconscious guard and lunged onto my target, who was still struggling beneath my boot. Nate moved with a fluid, lethal choreography, transitioning from the floor to deliver a devastating elbow strike to the side of the man's jaw. The guard's head snapped back, his eyes rolled, and his entire body went slack in the mud. The sudden, violent scuffle was over in less than 30 seconds. The night returned to its quiet, eerie stillness, broken only by the ragged sound of my own breathing. I stood there in the dark, my chest heaving, staring down at the two unconscious men lying motionless at my feet. My arms were shaking uncontrollably from the sudden dump of adrenaline, and my knees felt like they were made of water. I leaned heavily against the rusted metal siding of the barn, using the crowbar to keep myself upright. Nate did not waste a second celebrating. He immediately pulled a bundle of heavy-duty plastic zip ties from his tactical pockets. He rolled the first guard onto his stomach, crossing the man's arms behind his back and securing his wrists with a tight, professional pull. He did the same to the second guard, pulling the thick plastic bands so tightly they dug into the flesh, ensuring they could not break free even if they woke up. Then he secured their ankles together, checking their breathing to ensure they were stable but completely incapacitated. "Keep an eye on the tree line, Matthew," Nate muttered rapidly, his eyes scanning the dark driveway. "Make sure they didn't leave a driver in that SUV." I turned and stared at the dark silhouette of the matte black vehicle, parked 100 yards away. It remained motionless, its engine cut, sitting silently under the silver moonlight. We were completely alone. Nate systematically began patting down the subdued men, stripping them of their gear. He took their submachine guns and tossed the lethal weapons far out into the tall weeds and wild blackberry bushes where they could not be easily retrieved. He confiscated 2 sharp tactical knives, their encrypted cell phones, and the biometric scanner they had been connecting to the reader. Finally, Nate reached into the first guard's vest and pulled out a small, sleek object. He wiped the mud off its surface and held it up to my flashlight beam. It was a matte black electronic keycard. The front featured a prominent silver logo. I felt the air leave my lungs as I stared at the shape. I recognized the emblem instantly. It was the exact logo of Thorn Import-Export, the private brokerage firm that Julian and Audrey had established 2 years ago. It was the very same symbol printed on the business cards they had proudly handed me during our last family dinner. I had personally wired them $1,500 zeroed in from my own savings to help them secure their first office lease and shipping permits for that company. I had built their foundation, and now they were using those very corporate resources to hire mercenaries to hunt me down. The card itself was high-grade proximity PVC, a restricted access badge reserved for secure logistics vaults. It proved that Thorn Import-Export was operating high-security, off-manifest shipping terminals. My own daughter and son-in-law had dispatched their corporate security contractors to murder me. The reality of their betrayal hit me like a physical wave of cold nausea, freezing my veins. They hadn't just willed me a useless orchard. They were actively hunting me down to secure whatever was locked inside this barn. Nate looked at me, his face hard and expressionless. He didn't offer any useless words of comfort. He simply held out the key card, his eyes steady. "This is the key to the outer door, Matthew," Nate said quietly. "Let's find out what they are so desperate to hide." He stepped up to the keyless entry panel, pressed the black keycard flat against the proximity reader, and waited. The scanner emitted a soft electronic beep, and the flashing red light shifted to a solid, vibrant green. A heavy mechanical lock disengaged inside the doorframe with a deep, echoing clack. Nate grabbed the handle, pushed the heavy door open, and stepped inside. We stepped over the threshold, moving from the muddy clearing into the dark interior of the corrugated metal barn. I swept the bright beam of my heavy flashlight across the space. The outer section of the building was exactly what it appeared to be: a dusty, long-abandoned storage barn. Rusted steel cables, old fruit crates, and broken wooden pallets were scattered across the concrete floor. The air was thick with the scent of dry rot and bat guano, but as we walked deeper, past the first row of support beams, the facade of neglect ended abruptly. Standing barely 3 feet inside the wooden outer walls was a massive, reinforced steel bulkhead. It looked like the entrance to a military bunker, completely out of place in this agricultural valley. The structure was constructed from heavy, industrial-grade steel plates, complete with thick titanium hinges and a seamless frame embedded directly into a massive reinforced concrete slab. I noticed that the concrete around the steel frame was smooth and clean, lacking the moss and dirt of the older floor. This entire installation was recent, likely built within the last 3 years. Mounted at chest height beside the door was a glowing digital interface, featuring a numeric keypad and a red optical lens for a biometric retinal scanner that pulsed with a steady, rhythmic light. I stood frozen in the cold air, staring at the glowing red panel. The sheer scale of the engineering hidden inside this rotting barn was staggering. In my decades of shipping development, I had audited cargo terminals at major international ports, and I had never seen a private security installation this advanced. This bulkhead was designed to withstand a heavy physical assault, possibly even explosives. Nate stepped past me, his combat boots making no sound on the concrete. He examined the door with the professional detachment of a recon marine. He ran his gloved hand along the seamless edge where the steel plating met the concrete frame, checking for weak points. "There are no external wires, override boxes, or keyholes," Nate stated quietly, his eyes narrowed in the flashlight beam. "This is a closed-loop biometric security system. The keycard we took from the guards was only coded for the outer facade door. Getting through this inner bulkhead is a completely different story. It requires a direct retinal scan of an authorized user or a master override code entered directly into the keypad. Without the biometrics or the code, blowing this door would require military-grade shaped charges we don't have, and even then, it would collapse the entire barn structure on top of us." I stepped closer to the glowing red panel, my mind racing through decades of memories. Julian and Audrey clearly did not possess the required biometrics or the bypass code. That explained why they had dispatched a specialized tactical team equipped with an advanced biometric hacking device. They had been trying to bypass this very console when we ambushed them. But this bunker did not belong to my son-in-law. It belonged to my late wife, Clara. Clara spent her entire career managing Vance Logistics' financial records and shipping audits. She was a woman who lived by spreadsheets, encrypted databases, and fail-safes. She never did anything without a calculated, logical purpose. If she had built this underground fortress in absolute secrecy, she would never have left me completely locked out. She knew my technical limitations, and she knew that if I was pushed out of Malibu, I would eventually find my way to this Temecula property. She had designed this path for me. I stared at the keypad, which was currently displaying a blinking cursor on a small digital screen, demanding a 10-digit override sequence. My chest tightened as a painful memory pushed its way to the forefront of my mind. I remembered sitting in the sterile hospital room during Clara's final days, barely 3 weeks ago. The smell of antiseptic was suffocating, and the steady, monotonous beep of the heart monitor felt like a countdown. The illness had ravaged her body, and the heavy doses of morphine had seemingly eroded her brilliant, structured mind. During those agonizing last 48 hours, she had drifted in and out of consciousness, muttering quietly to herself. Audrey and Julian had stood in the corner of the room at the time, checking their phones, checking their designer watches, and complaining that her mother was losing her grip on reality, muttering nonsense. I had sadly agreed with them, thinking Clara's mind was failing. Clara had kept repeating a specific random sequence of numbers, her frail fingers gripping my hand with surprising strength. 4792, she had whispered repeatedly, her cloudy eyes locking onto mine with a fierce intensity I had foolishly chalked up to terminal delirium. I had spent hours stroking her hair, telling her to rest, completely ignoring the vital message she was desperately passing to me before her final breath. She wasn't losing her mind, she was leaving me the key. A profound wave of sorrow and immense clarity washed over my tired body. Clara had known her time was short, and she knew she couldn't trust our daughter. She had used her final moments of lucidity to give me the exact combination I needed to uncover the truth. But 4 digits were not enough. The digital interface demanded a full 10-digit sequence. I closed my eyes, tuning out the wind rattling the metal roof outside, and tried to think exactly like Clara. She was a woman of deep sentiment wrapped in practical logic. If she needed a 10-digit code that I would never forget, she would combine her secret numbers with the most important date of our shared lives, our wedding anniversary. We were married on August 14th, 1982. In digital format, that date was represented as 08-14-82. That was exactly 6 digits. Combined with the 4 specific numbers she had whispered on her deathbed, it would equal exactly 10 digits. Our combination was officially complete. Nate watched me in absolute silence, his eyes darting between my hand and the pulsing red digital display. The cold air inside the barn seemed to vanish, replaced by a suffocating heavy tension that made it difficult to breathe. We both knew the high stakes of this entry. If I had miscalculated Clara's logic, if I entered the wrong numerical sequence, a security installation this sophisticated would almost certainly trigger a hard lockdown, sealing the steel bulkhead permanently and alerting whoever was monitoring the security grid. It could even activate silent alarms that would bring more mercenaries straight to our location. I took a deep, steadying breath, letting the memory of Clara's final desperate whispers guide my fingers. I raised my hand toward the glowing red keypad. The keys were made of brushed aluminum, cold and solid to the touch. I pressed the first digit. 0, I whispered, the key emitting a soft, high-pitched electronic beep. I typed the next 5 digits, entering the numbers of our wedding anniversary, the day we had stood before our families and promised to build a life together. 81482, August 14th, 1982. The keypad registered each keystroke with a synchronized beep, the green cursor on the small digital screen advancing with every numerical input. The 6 digits stared back at me, glowing in the dim light of the barn. I paused for a fraction of a second, my heart hammering a furious rhythm against my ribs. The cold sweat rolled down the side of my face, stinging my eyes. I looked at the remaining 4 slots on the screen. This was the moment of truth. I entered the final 4 numbers Clara had whispered repeatedly on her deathbed, the sequence Audrey and Julian had dismissed as the delirium of a dying woman. 4792. The cursor reached the end of the screen, and a green confirmation prompt began to flash. I took a deep breath, braced my shoulders, and firmly pressed the enter key at the bottom of the pad. I stepped back, pulling the rusted iron crowbar close to my chest. We stood in absolute stillness, holding our breath. For 3 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. The red optical lens of the retinal scanner continued to blink rhythmically, silently processing the numerical entry. The silence in the barn was so thick, I could hear the steady dripping of rainwater from the eaves outside. Then, the red light on the retinal scanner suddenly shifted, glowing a bright, vibrant green. A deep, heavy mechanical thud echoed from within the thick steel door, a sound that vibrated through the concrete slab beneath my boots. It was followed immediately by the unmistakable hiss of depressurizing hydraulic seals, a rush of escaping air that sounded like a mechanical sigh. The massive titanium hinges groaned under the immense weight as the reinforced steel bulkhead slowly began to swing outward, releasing a sudden, powerful draft of crisp, chilled air into the dusty outer barn. Nate instantly stepped in front of me, raising his confiscated tactical knife and shifting into a defensive stance, his eyes scanning the expanding gap as the heavy door fully opened. But there was no immediate physical threat waiting for us inside the darkness. There was only the steady, rhythmic hum of high-powered electronics and the cool, sterile scent of climate-controlled air. We stepped cautiously over the thick steel threshold and entered a completely different world. The interior of the bunker was a pristine, meticulously clean environment that felt entirely detached from the rotting orchard and the rain-slicked valley outside. The walls were lined with thick, soundproofing panels that completely eliminated the howling wind and the patter of the rain. Bright, sterile LED lights automatically flickered to life overhead as our movement triggered the sensors, illuminating rows of towering black computer server racks that dominated the space. Thousands of tiny green and blue indicator lights blinked across the advanced hardware, processing a massive amount of encrypted data. Thick bundles of black cables ran from the servers, routed neatly along the ceiling and disappearing into the concrete floor, drawing energy directly from the industrial power line hidden out back. This was not a simple storage vault or a hidden workshop. It was a highly sophisticated off-grid data center. Nate lowered his tactical knife, his eyes sweeping across the humming machines with a mixture of awe and clinical assessment. He stepped forward, his boots clicking softly on the polished concrete floor as he checked for hidden security cameras or motion sensors. "This is an enterprise-grade data hub, Matthew," Nate said, his voice echoing slightly in the sterile room. "The processing power in this room is massive. Your wife didn't just build a bunker. She built a highly secure, independent network node. The physical infrastructure alone must have cost millions." I walked down the narrow aisle between the humming server racks, my boots feeling heavy. I was memorized by the sheer scale of what Clara had accomplished in secret, but it was not the towering servers or the flashing lights that caught my attention. At the very back of the long rectangular room, past the endless rows of data units, stood another massive structure, a heavily reinforced, walk-in banking vault, its polished steel dial and heavy locking bars gleaming under the bright LED spotlights. And sitting perfectly centered on a polished stainless steel desk in the middle of the room, directly under a single overhead spotlight, was a pristine white envelope. I walked slowly toward the desk, my hand trembling as I reached out toward the paper. The envelope was sealed with a drop of heavy red wax, stamped with the distinct emblem of Clara's personal signet ring, the one she wore every day of our marriage. Written across the front in Clara's elegant, familiar handwriting was my name. It was addressed simply, "For my beloved husband, Matthew." My thumb slowly traced the ink, my heart heavy with the weight of her voice speaking to me from beyond the grave. I ran my trembling fingers over the red wax seal, tracing the outline of the signet ring I had given Clara on our 5th anniversary. The paper felt thick and heavy, carrying the weight of a voice speaking to me from beyond the grave. A faint, nostalgic scent of lavender, the perfume Clara had worn every single day of our 40 years together, still lingered on the paper, bringing a sudden sharp ache to my chest. Beside me, Nate remained a silent, watchful guardian. He stepped back toward the reinforced entrance, positioning himself strategically near the open steel bulkhead. His eyes constantly scanned the dark, quiet perimeter of the barn outside, his hand resting near his suppressed pistol. He knew what this moment meant, and he was giving me the silent space I needed to face the truth. I took a deep, ragged breath of the chilled, sterile air, letting it clear the dust from my throat, and carefully broke the wax seal. I unfolded the heavy parchment paper. The date at the top was written 3 weeks before she was admitted to the hospital for her final decline. The ink was slightly smudged in places, as if her hand had been shaking or she had been crying while writing the words. I swallowed the thick knot in my throat and began to read her elegant script. "My dearest Matthew," she began, the words immediately flooding my heart with a profound, aching sorrow. "If you are standing in this room, it means my absolute worst fears have been realized. It means I am gone, and you have finally followed the breadcrumbs I left behind to discover the horrible truth about our family. I am so sorry for leaving you in the dark for the past 2 years. I needed to protect you, and the only way to keep you safe from the crossfire was to make you look like a harmless, ignorant old man in the eyes of our enemies. Please forgive my deception." I paused, my chest tightening. I stared at the words, "our enemies." Who were they? And why did Clara have to protect me by pretending to lose her mind? I remembered those long nights during her last years when she would sit in her study until dawn, surrounded by financial charts and shipping manifests. I had thought she was just struggling to sleep due to her pain, but in reality, she was fighting a quiet, desperate war to save us. I looked back down at the page. "I did not build this bunker because I was losing my mind, Matthew," the letter continued. "And I did not alter my last will and testament out of spite or cruelty. I did it because I discovered something truly terrifying about our daughter, Audrey, and her husband, Julian. I needed time to secure our true legacy before they could steal it all and destroy everything we worked our entire lives to build." I gripped the paper tighter, my knuckles turning white. Clara had always been a master forensic customs auditor, a brilliant woman who could spot a single irregular decimal point or a hidden cargo routing anomaly in a mountain of shipping ledgers. She was never wrong. 2 years ago, Julian asked me to review the financial ledgers for their new company, Thorn Import Export, Clara wrote. He thought I would simply glance at the top-line profits and congratulate them on their success. But I looked deeper. I followed the money trails, Matthew. I tracked the complex routing numbers, the offshore shell companies, and the layered dummy accounts they were aggressively setting up. Our daughter and son-in-law are not legitimate shipping brokers. They have partnered with a violent maritime smuggling cartel, using Thorn Import-Export to move illicit cargo and filter drug money through our shipping lanes. A wave of cold nausea washed over my body, making my head spin. I leaned against the polished steel desk, my vision blurring as the reality of the situation crashed into my brain. Thorn Import-Export was a front. My daughter, the girl I had proudly walked down the aisle, was involved in international smuggling. They have been drowning in debt to these people. Clara's letter continued. Julian made some disastrous investments in offshore shipping terminals, losing millions of the cartel's capital. To save their own skins, they agreed to let the syndicate use our logistics network. But their ultimate plan was far more sinister. They were quietly planning to merge Thorn Import-Export with Vance Logistics, effectively taking over our entire fleet. They wanted to use our clean, established shipping routes as their primary laundering machine, drawing our family name into their dirty world. I stared at the paper, the hum of the servers around me suddenly sounding like a warning siren. Julian and Audrey weren't just greedy. They were trapped in a high-stakes criminal underworld, and they were willing to drag my life's work down with them. I knew that if I confronted them directly, Julian would panic and try to silence us both, Clara wrote, and so I played the role of a declining, paranoid mother. I used my extensive financial networks to secretly liquidate the vast majority of our liquid assets, our stock portfolios, and our mutual funds. I quietly converted over 40,000 into physical bearer bonds and offshore logistics deeds, hiding them right here in this secure bunker, entirely out of their reach. I left them the Malibu estate and our visible accounts to serve as a distraction to keep them occupied, while I secured our true wealth. She knew they would be too distracted by the 12,000 Malibu property to worry about a supposedly worthless orchard in Temecula. The decoy worked perfectly, but it was only the first part of her plan. She left me with the key to their destruction. I felt a sudden, deep sense of pride in my wife. Even in her final months, when she was in so much physical pain, her sharp mind was still actively protecting me. She had outsmarted them all, and now she was handing me the weapon to finish it. I turned the page of the letter, the crisp paper crackling in the sterile room. I focused my eyes on Clara's tight, precise script, prepared for whatever truth she had laid out. The next paragraph explained the exact legal structure of her plan, demonstrating the brilliant forensic mind I had loved for 4 decades. You might wonder why I willed the $12,000 00 Malibu estate to Audrey and Julian if my goal was to protect our legacy, Clara wrote. The Malibu house was the administrative and registration hub for Julian's shipping shells and Thorn import-export. Under federal maritime law and the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, specifically codified under Title 18 of the United States Code, Sections 1961 through 1968, the federal government has the power to seize assets linked to organized crime. Any property used as a primary location for smuggling and money laundering is subject to immediate government seizure and civil asset forfeiture. If I had left the Malibu estate to you, Matthew, you would have inherited the legal title of a smuggling hub. You would have been the primary name on the deed when the federal authorities inevitably raided the property. The Department of Homeland Security and the FBI would have arrested you, frozen all your assets, and thrown you into a federal prison for the rest of your natural life. I stared at the words, a cold sweat breaking out across my chest. My wife's writing was steady, detailing a legal trap that made my blood run cold. Or worse, the letter continued, the smuggling syndicate would have eventually realized that federal investigators were closing in. They would have needed a convenient, disposable scapegoat to take the fall for their missing cargo. They would have silenced you permanently, leaving your body in an alleyway to tie up their loose ends. I could not let that happen. And so, in my final act of love, I willed the Malibu estate directly to Audrey and Julian. I legally bound them to their own criminal hub, removing your name from the blast radius. I effectively tied the noose securely around their necks, giving them the property to let them hang themselves with their own rope. They think they outsmarted us, completely unaware that they have legally assumed sole liability for a ticking financial bomb. I leaned my elbows on the polished steel desk, my hands gripping my hair. The sheer brilliance of her legal defense was breathtaking. She had completely insulated me from the criminal liabilities of Thorn import-export. But it was the final paragraph of the letter that shattered the last remnants of my composure, transforming my shock into a state of pure, unadulterated fury. The pen strokes on the paper grew darker and heavier, as if Clara had been writing with a desperate, rushed intensity. Matthew, please listen to me carefully, she wrote, the words practically screaming from the page. Julian and Audrey have become desperate. The cartel has increased the pressure, demanding immediate access to our logistics channels. I have refused to sign the corporate merger documents, and I know they are growing impatient. They are currently administering my daily medications in the hospital room. I strongly suspect they are actively accelerating my decline to gain immediate control of our estate. If you are reading this, Matthew, it means my heart finally gave out, or they helped it give out. Do not let them destroy your life. Open the safe, take the bearer bonds and the manifests. Expose them. Destroy their empire of shadows. I love you forever, Clara. The air in the bunker suddenly felt freezing cold. My breath caught sharply in my throat as the devastating implication of those words hit my brain. My daughter and son-in-law hadn't just betrayed me. They had murdered my beautiful wife. They had stood over her hospital bed, pretending to care for her while slowly poisoning her system to gain access to the will. And today, Audrey had handed me that same unmarked bottle of pills, telling me it was Clara's dying wish, hoping I would swallow the poison, drive off a mountain cliff, and disappear forever. I let out a low, ragged sound of unadulterated anguish that echoed off the soundproofed walls of the data center. It was a cry of pure grief that rapidly condensed, hardening into a sharp spear of absolute, righteous rage. The sorrow that had weighed down my bones for the past month evaporated into the chilled air. Nate turned his head slowly. his dark eyes locking onto mine with a silent, supportive understanding. He stepped over to the desk, looked at the letter, and gave a tight, grim nod. He understood that this was no longer a simple family dispute. It was a criminal conspiracy that had cost my wife her life. He didn't ask what was written in the letter, and he didn't offer empty words of comfort. The rigid, ready posture of his body told me everything I needed to know. He was my brother in arms, and he was ready to go to war for me. I gently folded the heavy parchment paper and slipped it into the inner pocket of my jacket, next to my heart. I was no longer a grieving, confused widower. I was a man who had just discovered that his own daughter was a murderer. I was the founder of Vance Logistics, and my brilliant wife had just handed me the ultimate weapon to exact, complete, devastating justice. I turned away from the desk and walked with slow, deliberate steps toward the massive walk-in banking vault dominating the back wall of the bunker. I reached out my fingers, no longer shaking, but perfectly steady and resolute. The heavy vault door featured a massive chrome dial and an electronic keypad, waiting for the code Clara had hidden in her final words. I took a deep breath, reached out my hand, and prepared to dial the numbers that would unlock our family's true legacy and seal the fate of our betrayers. I reached out my hands, no longer shaking, and gripped the cold chrome dial of the banking vault. Using the final combination Clara had left in her letter, I spun the wheel with a slow, deliberate precision. Each click of the internal tumbler resonated through the steel door with a sharp metallic clack, a sound that felt incredibly loud in the sterile silence of the bunker. I finished the final sequence, gripped the heavy steel locking bar, and pulled with all my strength. The hydraulic locking bars slid back with a deep mechanical groan, and the massive door swung open smoothly on its titanium hinges, revealing the inner cavity illuminated by the cool LED spotlights. I stood there completely mesmerized by the contents stacked neatly inside the safe. There were no piles of cash or glittering gold bars, but as a shipping magnate, what I saw was infinitely more valuable. The shelves were organized with thick, waterproof portfolios, leather-bound ledgers, and banded stacks of heavy parchment paper. I reached in and pulled the first portfolio from the top shelf, my breath catching as I flipped through the crisp pages. They were physical bearer shares and shipping bonds, issued in secure international jurisdictions like the Cayman Logistics Trust and Swiss Shipping Bank, far beyond the reach of American regulators or Julian's legal probes. Beside them sat deeds for offshore container yards, land patents, and high-yield trust funds. I mentally calculated the figures as I turned the pages. The combined value of these decentralized, untraceable assets was staggering. It easily exceeded $80,000. I leaned against the steel desk, a profound wave of awe and sorrow washing over me. Over the past 2 years, while battling a terminal illness and pretending to be a declining, confused old woman, Clara had executed a financial masterclass. She had slowly, methodically siphoned the vast majority of our legitimate corporate wealth out of our visible accounts, liquidating our vulnerable holdings and funneling every single dollar into this off-grid vault. The Fruit Depot in Temecula was a brilliant decoy. She had kept a dead asset on our books specifically to build this bunker right under the nose of a daughter who believed she was manipulating her. But as I stared at the wealth, my developer instincts probed deeper. Why had she willed the Malibu estate to Audrey if she knew it was fully leveraged? I turned back to the safe, running my hands along the lower recessed shelves. Tucked away in the bottom corner, separated from the bearer bonds, was a thick, bright red folder. It was marked with a single, ominous word written in Clara's sharp handwriting: liability. I pulled the heavy folder from the safe, carried it to the desk, and untied the string closure. I flipped open the cardboard cover. Inside were dozens of pages of highly detailed, complex forensic accounting ledgers. My eyes scanned the rows of numbers. Following the highlighted pathways, Clara had painstakingly mapped out over the last 24 months. She had tracked every single transaction connected to Thorn Import-Export and our Malibu residence. What I saw on those pages made my blood run entirely cold. The Malibu estate was indeed fully dangerously leveraged. Audrey and Julian had taken out multiple high-interest loans against the property without my knowledge, but the loans were just the tip of a massive, bloody iceberg. Clara's notes detailed a horrifying complex web of illicit activity. Audrey and Julian were using the Malibu property and Thorn Import-Export as a front to launder millions of dollars for a violent maritime cartel. They were routing illicit cargo through ports in Panama and Colombia, using Vance Logistics shipping containers to bypass customs, and filtering dirty money through fake port fees, phantom shipping manifests, and dummy freight charges, all tied directly to the address of our Malibu residence. They had turned our home into the administrative hub of a major smuggling enterprise. I gripped the edge of the desk, my legs trembling as the pieces fell into place. If Clara had allowed the Malibu estate to pass to me in the will, I would have inherited the legal ownership of a smuggling front. I would have been the target of a federal raid. The Department of Homeland Security and the FBI would have arrested me, frozen all my remaining assets, and thrown me into federal prison. Or worse, the cartel would have used me as a scapegoat to cover their missing millions, silencing me permanently. Clara had seen the trap Julian had laid. She had seen the federal indictments and the cartel assassins waiting in the shadows. And so, in her final act of love and protection, she flipped the trap entirely. She gave the Malibu estate to Audrey, legally binding her to her own criminal hub. She removed my name from the blast radius and tied the noose securely around Julian and Audrey's necks. She gave them the house to let them hang themselves with their own rope. I stared down at the bright red folder, a dangerous smile slowly spreading across my face. Clara had not just saved my life. She had handed me the ultimate weapon to destroy the people who had tried to bury me. Nate stepped closer, looking at the ledgers over my shoulder. "This is a roadmap to a federal indictment, Matthew," he said quietly, his voice hard. "Homeland Security would freeze their operations within hours of seeing this." "They aren't just going to lose their assets," I whispered, my voice dripping with cold resolve. "They are going to lose their freedom forever. I will make sure the law extracts every ounce of justice for Clara." Nate looked at me, a cold fire in his dark eyes, and gave a slow, approving nod. "We have the physical evidence, Matthew," he said, turning back to the primary computer terminal. "Now, let's look at the digital files on the main monitor. There is more in here. We need to know what else is on these servers." Nate moved past me, his fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard connected directly to the master server terminal. A bright blue screen flickered to life, illuminating his hardened features. He accessed the primary directory, bringing up a list of encrypted folders. There were thousands of corporate financial registries, shipping manifests, and customs clearance databases. But right in the center of the main desktop, a folder labeled with my name stood out. Underneath it was a subfolder simply titled Investigator Files. Nate clicked on the folder, populating the screen with a long list of high-definition video files. Each was meticulously labeled with specific dates and timestamps, corresponding to the final 2 weeks Clara spent in the VIP oncology wing of Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. A cold, heavy dread settled in my stomach. She had hired a private investigator to secretly install hidden cameras inside her own hospital room. The cameras had been hidden inside a clock radio on the bedside table and a smoke detector on the ceiling, capturing multiple angles. She knew she was surrounded by vipers, and she wanted every single moment of her final days documented and preserved in this off-grid vault. Nate glanced up at me, his dark eyes reflecting a silent, grim warning. "Are you absolutely sure you want to watch this, Matthew?" he asked quietly. I swallowed past dry lump in my throat and nodded. "Play the final video, Nate," I whispered, my voice sounding fragile in the humming server room. Nate double-clicked the last file. The video expanded to fill the monitor. The high-definition footage showed Clara lying incredibly still in her sterile hospital bed, hooked up to a complex array of medical monitors and intravenous drips. She looked so fragile, so consumed by the illness. The timestamp in the corner indicated it was recorded on a Tuesday evening, barely 3 hours before the hospital officially pronounced her dead. I felt a suffocating sorrow watching her chest rise and fall, but the quiet was shattered when the door to her hospital room swung open. Audrey and Julian walked into the frame. They were dressed impeccably, completely unaffected by the grim atmosphere of the intensive care unit. Audrey wore a tailored designer coat, and Julian clutched a leather briefcase. They stood at the foot of Clara's bed, staring down at my dying wife, with a cold, detached impatience that made my stomach churn. Julian checked his expensive gold watch, letting out a heavy, irritated sigh. The audio feed from the hidden camera was crystal clear, capturing every single whisper. The shipping syndicate needs the Vance Logistics assets transferred to my name by Friday, Julian said, his voice entirely devoid of any human empathy. The cartel enforcers are waiting at the marina, and they are losing patience. She is taking entirely too long to die. The sheer brutality of his words struck me like a physical blow. My son-in-law, a man I had supported and welcomed into my family, was complaining that my wife's survival was inconveniencing a smuggling cartel. Audrey stepped forward, moving with a chilling, calculated grace. She unzipped her designer handbag and pulled out a small, unmarked medical syringe filled with a clear, unknown liquid. "We cannot afford to wait for nature to take its course, Julian," Audrey whispered, her voice laced with a dark, terrifying pragmatism. "If the transfer is delayed, the cartel will come after us. They won't accept excuses about a lingering mother. We need the Vance shipping lanes operational by tomorrow." I watched the screen in absolute horror, my hands gripping the edge of the steel desk so tightly my knuckles ached. Audrey moved to the side of the hospital bed. She leaned over my helpless wife, her face completely expressionless, and injected the clear liquid directly into Clara's primary intravenous line. The reaction was almost instantaneous. Clara's fragile body arched violently off the mattress. She began to convulse, her arms thrashing weakly against the sterile sheets. The medical monitors next to her bed immediately began to flash red, emitting a series of shrill, frantic alarms. Julian did not call for the nurses. He simply stood there, watching his mother-in-law fight for her final breaths with the cold detachment of a butcher 10, agonizing. Seconds later, Clara went completely still. The monitors flatlined, emitting a continuous deafening electronic whine. Audrey calmly dropped the empty syringe into a medical waste bin, smoothed down her designer blazer, and stepped back toward the door. "It's done," she said coldly. "Call the nurses and start crying." The video continued to roll, showing Julian dramatically dropping to his knees and burying his face in his hands as the medical staff rushed frantically into the room. It was a perfect, sickening performance. I remembered the funeral, how Audrey had wept on my shoulder, begging me to stay strong. That fake display of grief now made my skin crawl with absolute disgust. My own daughter had murdered her mother for a shipping merger. They had executed the woman who gave Audrey life, all to satisfy the financial demands of a maritime cartel. I stood frozen in the cold bunker, staring at the paused image of Clara's lifeless body on the screen. The profound, suffocating grief that had consumed my soul for weeks vanished entirely, replaced by an icy absolute rage that burned hotter than the sun. The betrayal was total, unforgivable, and completely evil. They had killed her, and they had tried to kill me tonight. "They are going to pay, Nate," I whispered, my voice dropping to a low, lethal hum. "Every single one of them. I don't care what it takes or how much it costs. I will dismantle their lives piece by piece until they have nothing left but the cold walls of a prison cell." Nate stood up, his face grim and resolute under the sterile lights, and placed a heavy hand on my shoulder. "Then let's get to work, Matthew," he said, his gravelly voice filled with a quiet intensity. "We have a war to win, and the first battle starts tonight." Suddenly, a loud, high-pitched electronic alarm began to beep rapidly from the master server console. A bright amber warning box flashed in the center of the monitor screen, displaying the words, "Perimeter Alert, Zone 1." The external motion sensors and military-grade thermal radar Clara had installed around the entire 25-acre orchard, and the winding dirt road had been aggressively tripped. Nate reacted instantly. He tapped a series of command keys, splitting the monitor screen into a multi-camera surveillance feed that displayed real-time footage of the farm's exterior. Through the infrared lenses, we watched as several blinding shafts of light aggressively sliced through the thick darkness of the valley. The low, customized rumble of multiple high-powered engines echoed in the distance, vibrating through the thick concrete walls of the bunker. Three massive, armored, black Chevrolet Suburbans pulled up the dirt driveway in a tight, tactical formation. They were modified with heavy ballistic plating and run-flat tires. They were followed closely by a sleek, high-end luxury sedan. The vehicle swept onto the grass and parked in a coordinated, defensive semicircle, their glaring headlights pointing directly at the entrance of the barn, illuminating the structure in a harsh white glare. My chest tightened as the doors of the luxury sedan swung open. Julian Thorne and my daughter, Audrey, stepped out onto the muddy earth. They were not wearing their designer clothing tonight. They wore dark, practical jackets, but they were not alone. From the 3 armored SUVs, a dozen heavily armed enforcers poured out, dressed in tactical gear and carrying suppressed submachine guns. They quickly formed a security perimeter around the sedan, their weapons raised as they established crossfire sectors and secured the barn's perimeter to ensure nobody could escape. Audrey stood in the center of the clearing, her eyes narrowing as she stared at the empty, dark farmhouse. Julian gestured frantically toward the barn, pointing to the 2 unconscious, bound scouts lying in the mud near the entrance. They had realized their vanguard had been compromised. I stared at Audrey's face on the high-definition monitor. I remembered her first day of school, how she had cried and held my hand, and how I had promised to always protect her. The sweet, innocent child I had raised had vanished entirely, replaced by a cold-blooded, calculating killer who had poisoned her own mother. "Nate," I whispered, my voice incredibly cold. "They're here. I see them," Nate replied, his voice dropping into a flat, professional tone. He immediately reached for the manual override lever beside the inner bulkhead. He pulled the heavy steel handle downward, engaging the master lock. The massive titanium door slid shut with a deep hydraulic hiss, followed by the heavy clanging of 3 steel locking bars sliding into the concrete frame. We were officially sealed inside the subterranean bunker. The sound of the wind, the rain, and the idling engines outside vanished instantly, replaced by the sterile hum of the server racks. Nate stepped back from the console, analyzing the surveillance feeds. "The physical security of this bunker is top tier, Matthew," he stated calmly, checking the hydraulic pressure gauges on the door frame. "The concrete walls are reinforced with steel rebar, and the bulkhead door is rated to withstand high-velocity impact. Handguns and submachine guns won't even scratch the surface. But they aren't stupid. They brought heavy tools." I looked at the monitor. Several enforcers were unloading large, heavy crates from the back of the armored SUVs. They pulled out thick hoses, gas canisters, and a heavy-duty industrial thermal cutting torch. On the camera feed, a bright, blinding spark suddenly erupted as they ignited the torch, the hissing sound of the pressurized oxygen tank faintly picked up by the external microphones. They began to burn through the outer wooden facade of the barn to reach the concrete frame. "They have a portable exothermic cutting rig," Nate said, checking his watch. "An oxygen lance like that burns at over 4,000 degrees. They won't be able to blow the door, but they can burn through the hydraulic sealing valves. It will take them about 20 minutes to compromise the lock. Once the seals melt, they can use a winch to pull the door open. We are trapped in here." I stared at the screen, watching Audrey speak into a handheld radio. Her face was a mask of cold determination. There was no hesitation in her eyes, no regret. She had come to finish the job her scouts had failed to complete. She wanted the bearer bonds, the data files, and my death, but I did not feel a single shred of fear. I felt a strange, absolute clarity. I had spent my entire career managing complex logistical crises, routing cargo under pressure, and outmaneuvering competitors. This was just another logistics problem, and Clara had already provided the perfect parameters for the solution. "We aren't trapped, Nate," I said, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across my face. "They are. They think they have cornered a helpless old man in a hole. They have no idea they just walked into the exact arena Clara designed for them. They have placed themselves directly under the hammer." I walked over to the secondary terminal on the desk, where a small red button sat beneath a plastic shield labeled Network Broadcast. This was the master interface connected directly to the off-grid server racks. The terminal screen displayed a secure, high-speed satellite uplink, showing active connections to the Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, and the United States Coast Guard Maritime Intelligence databases. "Audrey wants a merger." I whispered, my finger resting on the plastic shield. Let's give her exactly what she asked for. I will broadcast every single bite of evidence we have. The federal agencies will have their warrants ready before the cutting torch even hits the main bulkhead. The terminal cursor blinked, waiting for my confirmation. I stood before the screen, feeling a cold, clean power. I was ready to pull the trigger that would end their reign of terror forever. I flipped back the protective plastic shield covering the red network broadcast button, my hand steady. On the server monitor, the terminal interface blinked, prompting me to enter my master administrative credentials for Vance Logistics. I typed in my private username and encryption passcode. A progress bar appeared, labeled, Preparing Data Package for Public Transmission. The server system began to package 3 primary blocks of evidence. First, the entire folder of forensic accounting ledgers Clara had compiled, detailing the $40,000 zero money laundering operation Audrey and Julian were running through Thorn Import-Export. Second, the digital cargo manifests and customs bypass logs, which pinpointed the exact ports in Colombia and Panama where their cartel associates were loading illegal containers onto our vessels. Third, and most devastatingly, the high-definition video surveillance files showing Audrey injecting the poison into Clara's IV line in her hospital room. This was the ultimate dead man's switch. Once activated, the satellite terminal would broadcast this data package to the secured databases of the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, the United States Coast Guard Maritime Intelligence Division, and major national news outlets. It was a complete, irreversible explosion of truth. I am setting a 15-minute countdown on the transmission, Nate, I said, my voice cold and calm. A digital clock on the terminal screen immediately began ticking down from 15 in glowing red numbers. If I do not enter my private cancellation code before the clock hits 0, the files will be broadcast automatically. There is no way for Julian to hack this server. It is completely isolated from their network. Nate watched the progress bar hit 100%, his arms crossed over his chest. 15 minutes is plenty of time for us, Matthew. But what is your plan? Are we just going to sit here and wait for the SWAT teams to arrive? No, I replied, my eyes locking onto the surveillance feed. I want to talk to them. I want to look Audrey in the eyes when she realizes she is lost. I want them to know exactly who pulled the trigger on their empire. On the monitor, the enforcers had successfully burned through the outer wooden wall of the barn. The blinding glare of the exothermic torch was now directly pressed against the massive steel bulkhead. A low, deep grinding sound echoed through the concrete frame of the bunker as the intense heat began to warp the outer metal plating, sending showers of white sparks flying in the dark barn. The temperature gauge on our side of the door began to creep upward. A faint smell of burning rubber and scorched metal began to seep through the ventilation intake system. Nate moved quickly, flipping an override switch on the wall to close the intake dampers, sealing the air loop inside the bunker. I turned to the auxiliary console on the desk. Clara had thought of everything. Beside the computer terminal was a heavy black microphone, connected directly to a series of high-powered public address speakers she had wired throughout the barn and the front yard. It was a closed-loop intercom system designed to communicate with anyone on the property. I flipped the toggle switch to the on position. A high-pitched squeal of feedback briefly echoed through the external speakers before settling into a deep hum. I gripped the cold metal microphone, took a deep breath, and began to speak. My voice boomed out into the slicked yard, echoing off the metal siding of the barn and the wet eucalyptus trees. Audrey Julian, I said, my voice completely devoid of any warmth or fatherly affection. I suggest you tell your enforcers to turn off that torch. You are wasting your oxygen. On the monitor, the reaction was immediate. The enforcer holding the thermal lance froze, the blinding sparks cutting off instantly. The entire yard fell into a sudden tense silence. Julian spun around in a panic, his eyes darting toward the high-powered speaker mounted on the barn roof. Audrey stood perfectly still, her face turning pale in the glaring headlights of the SUVs. She slowly pulled a handheld radio from her pocket, her thumb pressing the talk button as she looked toward the barn. "Father?" Audrey's voice crackled through the intercom speaker on the desk. sounding thin and strained against the background noise of the wind. "I know you're in there. I know you're with Nate. You need to open this door right now. If you cooperate, we can resolve this family matter quietly." I let out a cold, humorless laugh that boomed across the empty property. "A family matter, Audrey. Is that what you called it when you stood over your mother's hospital bed and poisoned her IV line? Is that what you call sending a dozen armed mercenaries to murder your own father in the middle of the night? I remember the dinner when you boasted about Thorn Import-Export. I trusted you, I wired you my savings, and this is how you repay us." Silence stretched across the clearing. Julian stepped closer to Audrey, whispering frantically into her ear, his face flushed with panic. He was checking his watch, looking back toward the dirt road. He knew that every second they spent at this farm was a massive risk. But Audrey simply pushed him away, her face hardening into a mask of pure, unadulterated venom. "She was in our way, Matthew." Audrey's voice hissed through the radio, the fake daughterly mask slipping away entirely. "She was going to destroy everything we built. She was going to hand Vance Logistics to a federal investigation. We did what we had to do to survive. And you are going to sign the merger papers tonight, or we will burn you out of that hole. We have the torches, and we have the manpower. You have nowhere left to run. If you don't open the door in 5 minutes, I will order my men to start burning the main structural pillars of this barn, collapsing it directly on top of your head." I held the cold metal microphone close to my lips, my eyes never leaving the monitor screen. I watched Julian Thorn pacing frantically in the headlights of his armored SUVs, his hands running through his hair in a fit of pure, raw panic. Audrey stood beside him, her jaw clenched, her fingers gripping the handheld radio like a weapon. The storm wind whipped around them, but the tension in the clearing was entirely stagnant. "You speak of burning us out, Audrey," I said, my voice echoing slow and steady across the yard. "But you don't even realize the matches are already lit beneath your own feet. You think you outsmarted us by forcing Clara to sign that will. You think inheriting the Malibu estate and our visible bank accounts was your victory. But Clara was 5 steps ahead of you." I paused, letting the silence settle over the clearing before continuing. "Do you know why she gave you the Malibu house, Audrey? It wasn't out of defeat. Under federal maritime law and the RICO Act, specifically codified under Title 18 of the United States Code, Sections 1961 through 1968, any property registered as the administrative hub of a smuggling operation is subject to immediate civil asset forfeiture and government seizure. The Malibu house is the registered office for Thorn Import-Export. The federal marshals will seize not just the house, but every single bank account, stock option, and domestic asset associated with your company. By taking the deed, you and Julian legally assume sole, undivided liability for the entire money laundering operation. Clara removed my name from the blast radius, and she tied the noose securely around your necks. You have legally bound yourselves to a federal crime scene." Julian froze. On the high-definition camera feed, I watched the blood drain entirely from his face. He turned to Audrey, his voice cracking with a sudden, high-pitched desperation that cracked through the radio audio. His breathing was erratic, and he pulled out his personal cell phone, trying to call his offshore banker in Panama. But the remote location in the heavy storm meant there was absolutely no signal. The screen of his phone was dead, a useless piece of plastic. "What is he talking about, Audrey?" Julian hissed, his hand shaking as he grabbed her arm. "Is that true? The legal liability? You said your mother was a paranoid old fool. You said she didn't know what she was doing. Shut up." "Julian!" Audrey screamed back, violently ripping her arm from his grip. She pressed the talk button on her radio, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and mounting panic. "You're lying, Matthew. You're trying to bluff us. You have no proof of anything." "We don't need to bluff," I replied coldly. "I am standing inside Clara's off-grid data center. Right next to me is a reinforced safe containing over $80,000. Zero in physical bearer bonds and offshore deeds, our entire family fortune, completely out of your reach. And right in front of me is a thick red folder labeled Liability. It contains every forensic accounting ledger, every offshore routing number, and every illegal cargo manifest you processed through Panama and Colombia." I leaned in closer to the microphone, my voice dropping to a low, devastating whisper. But that is not the most important file in this room, Audrey. We also found the video. The high-definition camera feed Clara had secretly recorded in her hospital room. The video that shows you pulling a syringe out of your designer bag. The video that captures you injecting the poison directly into your mother's IV line, while Julian stands by and watches her convulse to death. The clearing went completely dead silent. The wind seemed to die down, leaving only the sound of the rain. Julian stared at Audrey, his eyes wide with horror as he slowly took a step back from his wife. The enforcers stood motionless, their weapons lowering slightly. They were corporate security contractors, hired to protect assets, and they had no desire to get dragged into a double homicide and federal drug laundering case. They began arguing in hushed tones, looking back at the armored SUVs, refusing to step forward. And now, here is your countdown, I continued. I have activated the master deadman switch on this server. In exactly 10 minutes, the entire data package, the 40 mils and 1,000 laundering ledgers, the smuggling routes, and the video of Clara's murder will be broadcast via satellite directly to the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, the United States Coast Guard, and every major news network. The clock is ticking, Audrey. 10 minutes, and your entire empire of shadows dissolves into a federal indictment. Julian snapped. He grabbed Audrey by the shoulders, screaming directly into his face, completely forgetting about the radio in her hand. You poisoned her? Julian shrieked, his voice filled with pure, unadulterated terror. You said she died of natural heart failure. You told me it was a clean estate transfer. We need to leave, Audrey. We need to get to the marina, get on the boat, and get out of the country right now. The feds are going to raid the Malibu house. Get off me, you coward! Audrey roared, shoving him back against the hood of the sedan. She turned toward the barn, her eyes wild with a feral, desperate fury. She pressed the radio button and screamed at the hesitating enforcers, "Double the torch power! Burn through that door! I don't care if the structure collapses. We get those files, and we kill them both. Now, if you do not move, I will make sure the cartel handles your families." The enforcers, terrified of the syndicate's wrath, reluctantly picked up their weapons and stepped back toward the cutting rig, their movements slow and nervous. I released the microphone button and sat back, my heart beating in a cold, steady rhythm. The countdown was down to 8 minutes. The end was rapidly approaching. I knew there was no going back. The countdown on the master server terminal screen blinked steadily, the red numbers displaying 3 o'clock. The heat radiating from the thick steel bulkhead had become intense. The steel frame was glowing a dangerous cherry red, and the internal hydraulic seals were beginning to pop and hiss as the extreme temperature melted the fluid lines. A thick, acrid black smoke began to curl around the edges of the door frame. The enforcers outside were close to compromising the locking mechanism. Nate stepped in front of me, his suppressed pistol raised in a two-handed combat grip, his body positioned behind a heavy steel server rack for cover. I stood beside him, my fingers wrapped tightly around the rusted iron crowbar, my breathing shallow. We were prepared for a final violent confrontation if the door breached before the clock hit 0. But we never had to take that step. Suddenly, the external camera monitors flashed with a chaotic array of blinding blue and red strobe lights. The dark valley was instantly flooded by the wailing sirens of dozens of high-powered vehicles roaring down the winding dirt road. Multiple tactical SWAT trucks, FBI hostage rescue team armored vehicles, and Homeland Security Investigations SUVs tore through the overgrown weeds of the front yard, their heavy tires throwing up massive sheets of mud as they slid into a tight, tactical blockade around the clearing, their lights reflecting off the wet eucalyptus trees and puddles of rainwater. Above us, the heavy, rhythmic thrum of rotors shook the sky as 3 police helicopters broke through the rain clouds, their powerful searchlights aggressively sweeping the orchard, illuminating the entire clearing in a daylight-bright glare. Dozens of highly trained tactical officers in heavy Kevlar gear leaped from the vehicles, their automatic rifles raised as they closed the perimeter. "Federal agents!" A booming voice shouted through a megaphone from the lead SWAT vehicle. "Drop your weapons and get on the ground. Do it now. You are completely surrounded." The reaction in the yard was immediate. The cartel enforcers, realizing they were completely outgunned, outnumbered, and caught in the blinding glare of 3 helicopter searchlights, did not hesitate. They dropped their submachine guns onto the muddy gravel and raised their hands in the air, slowly dropping to their knees. The enforcer holding the thermal cutting rig let go of the torch, letting it clatter to the concrete slab where it hissed harmlessly in the mud. The tactical officers rushed forward, ordering the enforcers to lie flat on their stomachs. They zip-tied their wrists behind their backs, cataloged their weapons, and secured the entire scene in a matter of minutes. Julian Thorne snapped completely. He fell to his knees in the mud, crying hysterically, his hands raised high as he began shouting confessions at the approaching tactical officers. "It was Audrey," Julian shrieked, his voice carrying clearly over the wailing sirens. "She poisoned Clara. She did the injection. I had nothing to do with it. She bought the chemicals online through a dummy account, and she was the one who altered the medical logs. I only helped transfer the money. Don't shoot. I will tell you everything, I swear." Audrey turned and glared down at him with a look of pure, murderous disgust. She ignored the warning shouts of the tactical officers and lunged toward the luxury sedan, trying to reach her bag. But before she could even touch the door handle, 3 federal agents tackled her to the muddy ground. They pinned her arms behind her back, ratcheting the steel handcuffs tightly around her wrists. Audrey's face was slammed into the wet mud, her designer jacket ruined, her eyes wild and feral as she screamed obscenities at the sky. Inside the bunker, the digital clock on our terminal screen hit 0. A green notification box flashed, displaying the message, "Transmission successful. Data packages received by federal registries." The trap had closed completely. A loud, structured knock vibrated through the warped steel bulkhead, followed by a voice calling out through the intercom system. "Matthew Vance? Nate Briggs? This is Special Agent Harris with the FBI. The perimeter is secure. Please disengage the lock and step out with your hands visible." Nate lowered his suppressed handgun, his face shifting back into a relaxed, calm expression. He reached over and pulled the manual override lever upward, releasing the remaining locking bars. The heavy steel door, warped and scorched from the heat, slowly swung open. We stepped out of the data center, walking through the smoky entrance of the barn, and out into the glaring white searchlights of the clearing. The rain had completely stopped, and a few stars began to twinkle through the breaking clouds, casting a natural peace over the chaotic scene. The cold night air felt incredibly clean, washing away the smell of burning metal and ozone. Special Agent Harris, a tall man in a dark tactical windbreaker, walked up to us. He looked at me with a mixture of respect and professional curiosity. He extended his hand and I shook it firmly. "Mr. Vance," Harris said, his voice calm. "The satellite data package we just received is the most comprehensive, detailed evidence file I've ever seen in my career. Your wife was a forensic genius. She mapped out their entire operation, and that hospital video, it's a closed case. We have everything we need to dismantle the cartel's shipping hub and secure a first-degree murder conviction." "She was a remarkable woman, Agent Harris," I replied, my voice steady. "She always saw the details." I stood at the edge of the concrete slab, my hand resting on the rusted iron crowbar, watching the federal marshals load Julian and Audrey into separate transport vehicles. Audrey turned her head as she was being pushed into the back of an armored SUV, her eyes locking onto mine through the glare of the flashing lights. There was no daughter left in those eyes. Only the cold, defeated rage of a cornered predator. I felt no pity, no regret, only a deep, clean sense of closure. The justice Clara deserved had finally begun. I simply watched her disappear into the dark interior of the vehicle, the door slamming shut with a heavy, final thud. The gears of justice turned with a grinding, unstoppable force. Over the following months, the federal prosecution, backed by the mountain of forensic evidence Clara had preserved, dismantled Thorne Import-Export and the criminal network associated with it. The legal proceedings were swift and devastating. Special Agent Harris and his team at the FBI utilized every single document in the red folder, mapping out the illicit transactions with absolute clinical precision under the Federal Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, also known as the RICO Act. the government executed a massive sweep. The $12,000 Sozuzano Malibu estate, which Audrey and Julian had so desperately fought to secure, was immediately seized under civil asset forfeiture laws. The property was boarded up, its deeds held by the federal government, serving as a silent, decaying monument to their greed. Thorn Import-Export was legally dissolved and completely liquidated, its assets frozen to pay off outstanding federal fines and restitution. Julian's offshore shell accounts in Panama were seized under international cooperation agreements with Panamanian authorities, stripping them of every dollar. Audrey and Julian faced the full weight of the law in a federal trial that dominated the national news. During the trial, the prosecution played the high-definition hospital room surveillance video to a stunned, silent courtroom. The jury watched in absolute horror as Audrey injected the poison, and the verdict was reached in less than 2 hours. Due to the video, which captured the murder of Clara in indisputable detail, the state prosecutors secured a first-degree murder conviction against Audrey. She was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Her designer lifestyle replaced permanently by the cold, concrete walls of a maximum security federal penitentiary. Julian, who had broken down immediately in the mud, cooperated fully with the prosecution. In exchange for testifying against the cartel's shipping leads and detailing their offshore routing networks, he avoided the death penalty, receiving a 25-year sentence for smuggling, conspiracy, and accessory to murder. Vance Logistics was completely cleared of any criminal association. The federal investigators verified that I had been completely kept in the dark and that the company's vessels had been illegally manipulated by Julian's port contacts. My name, built over decades of honest labor in the shipping logistics industry, remained pristine and untouched by the scandal. I stood in the warm, golden afternoon sun, looking out over the expansive Temecula Valley. The winter storms had finally passed, leaving the sky a clear, vibrant blue. The air was warm, carrying the sweet, clean scent of blooming wild lavender and eucalyptus. The 25-acre property, which my daughter had willed to me as a cruel joke, a dry plot of dirt she believed was worthless, was now my sanctuary. It was no longer a place of exile. It was the physical manifestation of Clara's brilliant mind, her final act of protective love. She had seen the storm coming years before I did, and she had built this fortress to ensure that when the dust settled, I would stand tall, fully protected. I walked slowly through the rows of the citrus orchard. We had cleared away the dead, overgrown branches, exposing the rich, dark soil to the sunlight. With Nate's help, we had begun planting new saplings, the young green leaves rustling gently in the warm wind. The property was coming back to life, matching the quiet, peaceful restoration of my own soul. With the 80 mills and thousand in secure, physical bearer bonds and offshore trust deeds safely transferred to my private accounts. I had more wealth than I could ever spend in a lifetime, but I had no desire for a Malibu mansion or a fleet of luxury cars. I had bought a modest truck, and I spent my days working the soil, feeling the earth beneath my hands and listening to the wind. Nate lived in a small cabin we had built near the edge of the tree line. We spent our evenings sitting on the front porch of the farmhouse, drinking coffee in the quiet twilight, talking about our decades of shared history. He had saved my life on that stormy night, and our friendship was a solid, unbreakable bond that kept me grounded. I stopped near the center of the clearing, looking back at the corrugated metal barn. The scorched wooden facade had been replaced, and the steel bulkhead door was now painted a clean, neutral white. The data center inside remained active, serving as a private, highly secure network that kept my assets safe from any future probes. I pulled Clara's signet ring from my pocket, letting the gold catch the warm sunlight. I closed my eyes, imagining her sitting in her study, her brow furrowed as she worked through the night, always analyzing the numbers, always seeing the details that everyone else missed. She had saved me from prison, from the cartel, and from my own blind trust in a daughter who had lost her humanity. The details always prevail, Clara, I whispered to the warm wind, a tear slipping down my cheek, not of grief, but of deep, profound gratitude. I opened my hand, letting the ring rest flat against my palm. I felt a deep, lasting peace settle over my chest. I had survived the betrayal, I had exacted complete, devastating justice, and I was free. I would live out the rest of my days in this peaceful valley, watching the trees grow, knowing that my wife's love had built a shield that nothing in this world could ever break. The storm was over, and the sun had finally returned. I turned back toward the farmhouse, the warm light of the setting sun casting long golden shadows across the freshly tilled soil. Nate was already sitting on the wooden porch, two steaming mugs of black coffee resting on the table between us. I walked slowly up the creaking steps, sat down in the rocking chair beside him, and took a slow, deep breath of the cool evening air. The quiet of the valley was absolute and beautiful, a clean, silent canvas upon which I could finally write the next chapter of my life. I was home, and I was finally at peace.